Let me also bring in now, in fact, a Member of Parliament in the UK, Bob Blackman, somebody who's been very vocal, in particular about the BBC and also about the questions increasingly being raised about the organisation. All right, it's a pleasure to have with us in our studio. We have a Member of Parliament in the UK from Harrow East, Bob Blackman. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking to us. Are you enjoying your India visit?
So far, so good.
I can't say the same for BBC, though, because quite coincidentally today, even as we speak, on the day there are searches being conducted on the offices of the BBC in multiple cities, a lot of people are wondering whether this is an effort to intimidate. How do you read the situation?
Well, obviously, the Indian authorities must investigate any allegations of fraud or income tax evasion. That's a matter for the Indian authorities. I'm obviously not in a position to comment on whether there's any evidence or any concerns, but clearly there must be some reason behind the searches, and I trust that that will be resolved very quickly.
Now, it's not just, and you've been one of the people who's been very frank when it comes to allegations against the BBC. This action aside, there have been protests against the channel in the UK itself, largely by the Indian diaspora, alleging that there is an inherent bias. What do you make of such protests? Well,
we've recently had this so-called documentary shown on the BBC, which was completely, a complete hatchet job on Prime Minister Narendra Modi and on the Indian government in general. It misrepresented everything that I know about India because it sought to tie in the fact that Prime Minister Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and of course the Gujarat riots occurred, that somehow, shape or form, that he did nothing to actually prevent them from happening, and almost that he encouraged them. Now, that contradicts the evidence of the judicial review that was conducted by the Indian Supreme Court, and that was almost dismissed. Equally, so the whole programme was completely biased, poorly researched, and in my view, shoddy journalism. That was commissioned by the BBC, by an outside organisation, but actually edited by the BBC, and I think it was irresponsible to show that. The second part of that documentary attacked modern India. And suggested that in somehow, shape or form that minorities were in danger in India. Well, as we all know, India is a secular country where people of all races and religions are welcome, and indeed their religions are celebrated. So to attack India on that basis, I think, was giving a misrepresentation of modern India and sought, I think, to drive a wedge between the United Kingdom and India, and I think that's quite wrong. At the moment, we've signed, obviously, between the UK and India, a cooperation agreement on many aspects of security, defence and other cooperation, and we are negotiating a free trade deal which will be immensely valuable for both the United Kingdom and for India. And so for the BBC to put something like this on was, I think, very poorly timed and indeed poorly researched.
It's a very interesting and important point you made. You said that this not only is a hatchet job, but maybe an attempt to try and damage the relationship between the two countries. Now, people will argue why. Why would the BBC do that? What would they possibly gain?
Well, the BBC is of course independent from government. The government doesn't control the BBC, nor should it. That's part and parcel of the independence under the charter that the BBC has. But the BBC has a responsibility, certainly in my judgment and other parliamentarians' view, to act responsibly. Now, that means, of course, that they are free to report and free to investigate, but to go back, frankly, over 20 years when things have been quite clearly dismissed as being without foundation, I think is quite wrong. And it sought to present a view. Now, why they did this, you'd have to ask them. But frankly, I detect a sort of anti-India bias in many aspects of what the BBC show. The BBC News is often negative about India as well, and modern India. And I think that's regrettable, because the relations between our two great countries are growing ever stronger, and so they should.
And it's not just an anti-India bias. In the recent past, in fact, just last year, we had spoken when there were anti-Hindu violence that took place, most notably in Leicester, where people were targeted not just for their ethnicity, but specifically for their religion, and the kind of barely veiled stand the BBC seemed to have taken at that time. Do you think it was a genuine slip-up or it was calculated?
I think there was, in Leicester, the real problem was that we've had people that have lived alongside each other for 50 years, be they Hindus, Muslims, or any other religion. And the fact is they lived peacefully alongside each other. Relations were good in Leicester. However, outside forces came in and interfered with that. And all the people that were arrested were from outside Leicester. There were a few people, obviously, that had got involved in the riots, who lived in Leicester, but most were from outside. That wasn't really reported properly, and I think that's regrettable. There was also, frankly, fake news went round, which Leicester police had to get involved
Deliberately by the BBC?
Not by the BBC. I think this was put out by in social media, people saying that a mosque had been attacked when clearly it hadn't been, and Leicester police had to put out.
But a lot of it was amplified by the BBC. Majid Freeman, for one.
Well, one of the problems is that, of course, they took this story without foundation, then continued with it. Leicester police then had to put out social media to say this story was not true. And, of course, we now have a position whereby reports are emerging about what really happened and who was behind it. So, you know, that is something that's going to come out over the next few months, I suspect.
Do you think, I mean, India and the UK are both very firm on the issue of freedom of speech.
Absolutely.
But given these recent episodes, is there a debate in the UK, as there is in India, about where responsibility and freedom of speech, maybe one needs to relook freedom of speech when there is an underlying agenda? Well,
I think the most important thing is that we should have and encourage freedom of speech. Freedom of speech between politicians, between competing ideas, is absolutely vital, so that people get both sides of a particular argument and can make up their mind. Politicians need to be free to speak their minds and to be challenged on their ideas. The one area I think we have to be very cautious of is when people speak without foundation and therefore try and make up a story and make it as if it's true. And it might be their idea, it might be their perception, but if it's without evidence, then I'm afraid it can lead to catastrophic consequences. And of course this is what we have to guard against. But at the same time, we've got, take a view that the answer is either yes or no, there's no shades between those two, and they listen to one side of the argument, they don't listen to both sides, and therefore their views can be made up, I'm afraid, in a very detrimental way for their own being and also the safety of the state.
And it's one thing to be radicalized, is the perfect point to get into the next section of our conversation, because it's just been 4 days when we had the review of Prevent, that report being accepted by the UK government. Now, one thing that really stuck out is the fact that it says that not only is there Islamist terror, which is the biggest threat, but that political correctness has stopped people from accepting it. Why do you think that is?
I think people are scared to speak out for being accused of being phobic towards one religion or one set of people or other. And it's almost a means of stopping people speaking their minds. And I think this is one of the problems, that that so-called political correctness, woke theory and so on, that we have to cope with. I think it's very, very important that we're in a position to be able to challenge things. And indeed, I think from people from the religious groups and religious leaders, are very important for them to challenge radicalisation and prevent that from happening in its own right. Our Prevent programme was to stop radicalisation of many different types. But obviously it's focused on people from the far right. It's also concentrated on Muslim radicalisation as well. And what we have to remember is we've got a huge Muslim population in the UK. We've got a huge Hindu population in the UK. Very small numbers of those have become radicalised. We've got to counter that and understand how that radicalisation takes place. I don't think that politicians, including myself, understand how this happens and why it happens, because parents don't know it's going on to their children probably until it's too late, because children have access to the internet and to social media, and that enables them to listen to one side of the argument only and not listen to the other side.
But Amnesty has already come out and called this report Islamophobic as well. Their logic is that there is an increasing focus being put
on a small minority because now it's politically convenient in the UK?
Well, I think the problem here is that we don't have a proper working definition of so-called Islamophobia. What we should be calling it is anti-Muslim hatred, as opposed to Islamophobia. I think that's very different between the two aspects, and people are scared stiff of being accused of being Islamophobic. It's not about being Islamophobic, it's all about a position of saying if people are radicalised and they become so radicalised that they commit terrorism, that is a serious threat to the welfare of the state and also the people that live within the state. We cannot allow that to continue to develop. Therefore, we have to counter that. Now, if people then say, by challenging that, you're somehow promoting hatred against a religion, that's not the case. And I think we've got to call it out for what it is. Because the PREVENT programme and the review of that, unfortunately, in my experience of the PREVENT programme, it's far too often it was the same organisations who were getting funding for their activities rather than looking at the nature of the problem. And I think that's where we've got to draw the line and change things.
In your estimation, how bad is the problem of radicalisation in the UK? Because in India, we have had multiple protests. This is a very real debate, as you would have seen. There were protests on the streets. There were calls for beheading. People lost their lives. But any time that this was called out, again, the debate was around whether there's Islamophobia being drummed up. Is the UK also worried about similar radical backlash?
We are worried about radical backlash, and we've just had a couple of incidents in the UK over this last weekend against asylum seekers who are in our hotels, where accusations have been made about some of those asylum seekers may have committed sexual crimes against young girls, and therefore there were violent protests. The concern is that this is all could escalate, and what we've got to do is bear down very, very hard on this type of escalation. Now, when we're talking about radicalisation, we are talking about very small numbers of people, but clearly any centres which promote radicalisation, any centres of learning, will have to be closed down. As simple as that. We cannot have a position whereby those centres would be allowed to continue with that sort of activity. We've also got to call out hate preachers from whichever religion and make sure that they are not given access to our young people who can cause, as I've said, immense damage.
Also, increasingly, the Indian diaspora, would you agree, is being more vocal in making the distinction clear between the radical Islamists and non-British people as a whole, that they shouldn't be all lumped together, and in saying that, listen, you have people of a certain religion who are of a large percentage, but a very small part of them are actually involved in any real crime, which is not necessarily the case when it comes to Islamic radicalism. Would you agree with that distinction being made now?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, for far too long in the United Kingdom, the area I represent, Harrow, has people from every country on the world, every religion under the sun, and virtually every language spoken on earth within my area, and we all live happily together. There's always tension, because there always is a bit of tension, but that's not between different communities. So it demonstrates that actually people can live together quite harmoniously. The problem, I think, has been particularly the Indian diaspora have been too quiet, too silent for too long. The whole thing is they are the least likely to be criminals, but the most likely to actually suffer a crime. They have the highest level of education and performance in our schools and going on. They're becoming the leaders of many of our industries and many of our different firms that we provide in our economy. So it demonstrates that they've done really well. At the same time, we have a very large number of people in prison who've committed crimes and been found guilty, obviously, through the judicial process. And the fact is they come from a particular religion. Now, we have to get behind that and say, why is that? And therefore deal with it accordingly.
Now, if we talk about the BBC documentary again, if I was to go back to that for a minute, many people were also wondering about its timing and whether it had anything to do with
the UK getting its first openly Hindu Prime Minister. Do you think that's a bit of a...
Well, we're very proud in the Conservative Party that we elected the first female Prime Minister, and we've had 3 of those. And now we've got the first Hindu Prime Minister. And it demonstrates to, I think, our country and to the world that within our party, certainly, it's not about who you are or your background. It's about how good you are to get to the top and to the top position. And Rishi has established himself very quickly. He did a very good job, as we all know, as Chancellor during the pandemic. He's doing an excellent job as Prime Minister and pulling us out of some quite tough, turbulent economic times. So he's done a very good job on that. Now, he's openly Hindu. He celebrates the Hindu religion. That's part and parcel of what he is. And actually, in many ways, the dharmic view guides his principles as Prime Minister and leader of the United Kingdom. That's great. I think that demonstrates that actually we can, in the United Kingdom, have the opportunity for people of all religions and backgrounds to go on. We've had a position, of course, where we've had several Hindu ministers and Muslim ministers. So we've demonstrated that actually it's not about your religion, it's about your ability. I think that's really positive. Now, in terms of whether the BBC are motivated by that, you'd have to ask them, frankly. I take the view that they shouldn't have shown that particular documentary series, or so-called documentary, because not only was it badly timed, but it's badly researched and badly performed. And it was deliberately, in my view, done in a way to demonise Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who clearly, as Prime Minister of India, is making an excellent job of running India at a time when we are trying to negotiate that free trade deal. And I think the BBC have questions to answer about why are you doing it then? Just at a crucial time in our history when potentially we have a free trade deal which will be hugely beneficial for both countries and would be excellent news for both economies.
Is there a pushback domestically against Rishi Sunak not just being the first Hindu Prime Minister, but being very open about it? The fact that you said that his dharmic view is what informs his style of governance. He said it was my dharma to be what I am today. Now, again, like the Prevent report says, political correctness. Maybe it's not perceived as politically correct for a Prime Minister to openly says it was my dharma, to openly be very Hindu in his habits, as it were.
Well, we should have no tolerance of people attacking people because of their values. And clearly, as Prime Minister, Rishi is demonstrating what he believes and what guides him as an individual, and that's to be celebrated, frankly. And it's fundamental values that you want to see in a Prime Minister and you want to see in leaders of a country. The fact they have a particular religion should not be a problem or an issue, nor is it for the United Kingdom. And in many ways, I think if you ask the average UK citizen, they wouldn't be thinking about that. They'd be thinking, frankly, at the moment, about the cost of living, the energy costs, the inflation rate that we've currently got, all the economic issues that we're grappling with, which, through his stewardship, I'm sure we're going to deal with, and we will be in a much stronger position as the year goes on, and then people will feel a lot better as a result.
In conclusion, we've covered a gamut of issues, but the one thing that, again, will play on a lot of people's minds, the BBC, of course, is autonomous, but it's ultimately state-funded. It is financed by the taxpayers of the UK. Can the government then do anything about it to ensure that such kind of misinformation, since you yourself are saying that it was poorly researched, if not overly malafide? Can the UK government do anything about it?
Well, I mean, I challenged our Foreign Secretary in the House of Commons to give his view. He clearly made very clear that, as far as the government was concerned, they disowned the Panorama series that was shown on BBC, and that the UK government had a long-term relationship and friendship with India. Now, as far as we're concerned, obviously the BBC is funded by the licence fee. So if you watch any form of broadcasting or listen to any form of broadcasting, you have to have a licence in the United Kingdom. Now, that's up for review. That's something that
a lot of us are saying, in this day and age, is that the right way of the BBC being financed? And this is not a threat to the BBC, by the way. It's a case of saying, look, is that the right thing to do, given that other broadcasting channels depend on advertising, and we have so many channels now on the various different spectrums. Why is it that the BBC is singled out? And what we've decided at the moment is that BBC and Channel 4, which are both publicly funded, should continue, so there's a bit of competition between those two channels, as well as, at the same time, the other free-to-air channels and also subscription channels. There is a view to say, should the BBC become a subscription channel, for example, so that viewers would be entitled to actually choose to purchase it or not. That's a valid discussion. What I would say to all the viewers who no doubt are watching back in the UK is, if you are concerned when you see something that you don't like, complain. You've got a right to complain because you're paying the licence fee. And then the BBC has to listen to you. And the more people that complain about their programmes, the more notice they must take of those complaints. Far too often, I have to say, the Indian diaspora in the UK do not complain. They don't complain about any bias or concerns that they have about the content of BBC programmes. They need to complain. They need to end their silence. But I'm afraid that's one of my criticisms of the Indian diaspora in the UK. They just get on with life and don't complain.
Well, for whatever lack of being vocal is there among the diaspora in India, I think the Indian media here more than makes up for it. Thank you very much, Mr. Blackman, as always, for speaking to us. Freedom of speech, of course, is not just about putting out what you want to, but equally of the viewer calling out when they think there is factual inaccuracies, whether unintentional or malified. Here's to much stronger relations and mutual progress of both countries. Thank you very much, Mr. Blackman, for joining us.
My pleasure.